And get started?
We should probably do the security announcement again.
Yes. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Scholars in Their Residence. A couple of ground rules before we get started. If your screen name does not have your name, we're going to ask you to click the three dots in the top right-hand corner of your little box, and please type in your name. iPhone or iPad or just a first name or just two initials is not okay. We want to make sure that there's one of the rabbis who are co-sponsoring knows one of the individuals. So please, if you'd be so kind to put a first name and last name, preferably yours. We will be getting started in just a moment. We will be muting all of you. And we're going to ask that if you have any questions or comments to place them in the chat room at the bottom of your screen. And one of our other moderators will take care with our scholar asking those questions. And without further ado, I'm going to call upon our host for this evening, which is Rabbi Harry Rosenfeld of Congregation Albert in Albuquerque, New Mexico.
Hi. Just a little background of what's going on. Scholars in Their Residence is a project of a group of us rabbis and our congregations. We get together and for a retreat every year, and we were talking, and Rabbi Litwack proposed, and we all said that was a great idea, that we collaborate and do this together. And so those of us who are a part of this group, we're really just so blessed to be able to bring this to you all as well. So we are pleased and honored to have with us tonight Dr. Stephen Windmueller, who comes to Albuquerque every other year. But since that wasn't going to happen this year, I proposed that we have him as part of this series. From June of 2006 through June of 2010, Dr. Windmueller was the Dean of the Los Angeles campus of Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. In March 2009, he was appointed to the Rabbi Alfred Gottschalk Chair in Jewish Communal Service. In 1995, he was named the director of the School of Jewish Communal Service, now the Zelikow School of Jewish Nonprofit Management at HUC. Prior to coming to HUCLA, he had a number of prominent positions within the Jewish community over the course of a 30-year professional career. And most recently, he served for 10 years as the executive director of the Community Relations Committee of the Jewish Federation of Los Angeles. Dr. Windmueller has previously served for 12 years as a Federation director in upstate New York and began his professional career on the staff of the American Jewish Committee. He's a specialist in political issues and American Jewish affairs. He holds a doctorate in international relations from the University of Pennsylvania and has had academic appointments at several major institutions of higher learning. He is a prolific writer, and that is an understatement. He is writing constantly, and everything he writes is of a really high quality and incredibly insightful. He's been a consultant, a program resource specialist to a wider range of institutions, including the American Jewish Committee, the ADL, the Council for Jewish Public Affairs, and the Federations of North America. He writes on the Middle East, Jewish public civic affairs, and global social trends, Jewish social trends, and mostly these days writing about Jewish political behavior, and has released several studies on Jewish voting patterns. He also serves on the board of the Pat Brown Institute of Cal State LA, a public policy think tank. He also has The Wind Report, a website, www.thewindreport.com. I'll put that in the chat in a second, and which serves as a repository of his extensive writings. So with that, Dr. Windmueller, I turn this over to you. Of course,
he's muted.
There you are. Hold on, let me get.
There we go.
Thank you, Rabbi Rosenfeld, and to each of the congregations that are joining us. Good evening, good afternoon, depending on your time zone. This is an extraordinary moment, not only for American Jews, but for this nation. And this afternoon, evening, we will begin to look at some of the issues that directly impact the American Jewish voter. I've asked, and Rabbi Brian Michelson has kindly agreed to assist me as we move through this presentation. So we should begin with the posting of the slides. The 2020 election, in many ways, is a hallmark for a variety of core reasons. And what we will be looking at tonight are some of the basic elements and tenets that define Jewish political behavior both now and in the past. As we move to the second slide, we are looking at the question of really a unique moment for this nation. Much of it is tied certainly to the issues associated with the COVID virus and the impact that will have on American attitudes and voting outcomes in November. More specifically, in many ways, the fall election is a referendum on governance, but it is also a challenge with reference to the very idea of trust. Trust in America has been declining. Ever since the Second World War, we have seen patterns whereby trust has been a factor that political scientists have measured. But increasingly, we have seen the effect of the element of trust in decline, as Americans have lost confidence in the presidency, the Congress, the courts, and other officials. But this is also a unique test in many ways with regard to the specific concerns associated with both the 2008 economic recession and now the 2020 crisis of a pandemic. These two, coming within a short period of time, have certainly challenged the American economy and are challenging voters in the context of trying to determine how they will view their future moving forward. The next slide, please. Jews have a long and important part of the American political tradition. We have been on this continent and as part of American civic society since the onset of the Republic. In fact, clearly Jews were very much important players both during the colonial period and at the outset of the American Revolutionary story. 3 states would limit Jewish political participation at the outset: Maryland, North Carolina, and New Hampshire. But ultimately, the American constitutional rights, as expressed both in the Sixth Amendment, in the 6th article of the Constitution, in connection with no religious tests, and the First Amendment to the Constitution, associated with freedom of assembly and certainly the notions of regarding religious freedoms. The American political story and its Jewish counterpart is particularly significant in connection with the fact that from 1840s all the way through to the current moment in time, Jews have been politically active as candidates, as commentators, and activists in various issues. Actually, from the period of 1860 moving forward, we would remind ourselves that Jews were historically Republican, overwhelmingly in support of President Lincoln, and would hold that position roughly till 1912. From 1912 moving forward, we would begin to see the impact of the Eastern European immigration's effect on American politics and political behavior as Eastern European Jews began to share their political ideas and values in the American story. So from the 1930s moving forward, we have seen a significant presence of Jews within the Democratic Party. So to remind ourselves, Jews have enjoyed in both political traditions of this country periods of time of dominance, influence, and important roles within those respective parties. Certainly, there have been external factors that describe and influence the Jewish political tradition. And these are often understood best by the fact that anti-Semitism and the issues of national security, the emergence of the State of Israel, the impact of the Shoah, were all defining moments in terms of how and when Jews would become politically connected and the ways by which that connection would be developed. Next slide, please. I don't see the slide, so I'm not sure what our audience is seeing. The next slide, please.
Dr. Windmueller, we are seeing Americans and their politics.
Mm-hmm. For some reason, I'm not seeing that, so I'm not sure.
Okay.
So I will proceed, even without seeing the order in which the slides are coming. So I apologize to the audience in terms of how this information may ultimately play out. I would point out to you that in the context of the American Jewish role in politics, we see a number of immediate and important factors. The first is that Jews have historically played three key roles. They have been candidates for public office, the first being a senatorial candidate from Florida in the 1840s, but always very much a part of the political storyline of American politics. Secondly, Jews have retained a major role as advocates for particular causes, and that has been seen throughout their history in this country, whether it was for the rights of women to vote, civil rights, or a host of other issues, that was particularly important. Certainly in the third category of activity of Jewish political involvement has involved financial participation and the extraordinary role that Jews have played in funding candidates, supporting political parties, and being involved in causes. With the rise of social media, we see a fundamentally different way by which politics in the United States and for this election will be carried forward. In many ways, the question of truth is raised in the context of how social media is being treated and how we understand its impact on voting behavior. And this is an important new reality for our political understanding. It suggests to us that there will be, as there were in 2016 and also in 2018, messages that will be misrepresenting Jewish interests or designed to misappropriate both the messages and the words that Jewish leaders are portraying or trying to convey. So social media will play, as we suggest, a major role with all of its challenges and complications, and with the realities that external forces have in the past and are likely again to try to use their influence in affecting outcomes of political activities in the United States. And this has an impact as well on Jewish audiences and Jewish candidates, as well as the general public. Because of the uniqueness of this election, we are looking at an election that will be generally managed by absentee ballots. And this will be an extraordinary test for the United States, because only 5 states are actually equipped and ready to accept all balloting by mail. 17 states are equipped to deal with particular audiences that have been approved or could be approved for voting by mail. So there is a huge transition moment happening at this very time in terms of the preparation for receiving and dealing with these kinds of ballots coming in. There is a great deal of uncertainty in all candor in terms of whether or not we will have an outcome on November the 3rd for this particular election. And many people believe that it will take several days, especially for states that are not nearly as prepared or equipped to manage and handle the volume of online or mail ballots. We are also looking at the reality of extremism in this country, as we have seen in recent weeks, but as we have also understood over the past number of years. And indeed, for American Jewish voters, for the first time in many years, they are looking at the challenges of dealing with pressures from both the right and the political left as they understand the 2020 election. The real challenges of Black Lives Matter and some of the issues associated with anti-Semitism, concerns associated with the BDS movement, in part define the political story on the left. And on the far right, we see in the alt-right and other expressions of white supremacists a different challenge that also concerns Jewish voters. The polling data suggests to us that for this election, the issue of anti-Semitism will increasingly be an important variable in understanding how Jewish voters will look at the 2020 campaign. Could we try the next slide?
Sure. There was one quick question that was asked, which was, what are the 5 states that are currently prepared to do all mail-in voting?
Yes. So Oregon and Washington are equipped to do so. Hawaii actually is a state that is equipped, and I believe Montana is a 4th one. As for the 5th one, I frankly am not certain at the moment what that state is. I think we need to understand that Jewish voters at this point are amongst the oldest voting class in American society. We're clearly among white ethnic voters, amongst the oldest population group in the society. And that represents, interestingly enough, some specific challenges to Jewish voters. Many Jewish voters post their concerns around healthcare, the economy, services and needs for seniors as core issues when looking at priority voting. We also see the significant amount of attention given by Jewish voters to actions taken by the courts, because so much of entitlement programs, as well as concerns that Jews have with regard to other constituencies, are tied to the courts. So interestingly enough, unlike other cohort voting groups, Jews pay particular attention to these both social delivery issues, economic issues, and court-related issues that drive much of their considerations. Jewish voters historically have voted with a whole array of interests. So when asking Jewish voters, what are your primary sets of interests? In an American Jewish Committee study of last year, there were a significant number of possibilities, so that Jews outlined anywhere from 7 to 12 major areas of concern. But interestingly enough, and we will come back to this in a few moments, the question of Israel as a voting priority was not reflected in the majority of American Jewish voting priorities. It is of concern as a second-tier question, and that changes relative to the issues happening in the Middle East. That is, if Israel's security is challenged, or if there are issues affecting the US-Israel relationship in ways that could be harmful, we see the rise of Israel as a higher category of concern. But over the course of most of the history of the Israel equation, Israel is ranked as an important but not a priority factor. The other interesting element here with regard certainly to Jewish voting behavior is seen as well in the context of the fact that Jews have remained historically very loyal to their political positions and parties. There is only slight movement. Indeed, changes occur around a particular personality or particular era or event, but the continued characterization of Jews voting with their sort of home party, their historic connected relationship, is an abiding feature of Jewish political behavior. What we are seeing are some interesting specific trends about Jewish voters. First of all, in the next slide that I think will demonstrate some of this, I have suggested that there are sort of 6 voting groupings of American Jews, and that on the Democratic side, they are urban progressive voters, liberal suburban Democrats, and what I call red diaper baby voters. The third one is the one that deserves the most attention, even though it represents probably the smallest sector. Historically, in the 1930s, Jews coming from Eastern Europe had a very deeply committed connection to socialist ideas and to ultra-liberal values. Those voters voted often for candidates that would be represented by third parties or were seen ultimately as reflective of particular progressive or socialist viewpoints. Often those voters were seen as sort of outcasts to the mainstream of where the Jewish community would be. Their grandchildren and great-grandchildren, interestingly enough, show some interesting characteristics in terms of where they were in opposing the Vietnam War and where they are today in terms of their politics, in terms of the progressive breakdown within the Democratic Party between centrists and progressives. And they represent that sort of category of voters. Urban voters and suburban Jewish voters, who are generally blue state or liberal Democratic voters, tend to be also very heavily embracing economic support for candidates and causes. And we see a significant amount of that, to the point that in the 2016 campaign, Jewish financial support for Hillary Clinton's campaign accounted for the top 5 donors and a significant piece to the amounts of monies raised by various parts of the Democratic Party's operations for 2016. We expect and are seeing similar patterns today within and amongst Democratic voters. But that is not unique to Democratic voters. On the Republican side, on the same slide as you move up the slide, you will see references to the fact that there are very strong identified, what I have described as single issue voters on the Republican side who see themselves as strongly pro-Trump, specifically identifying his policies and agenda with regard to Israel, his responses on their part in terms of his actions taken against immigration, and his support for national security. These single issue voters believe that in posing the question, is it good for the Jewish community, that Donald Trump provides that kind of response. But there are a second category of voters that are called never Trump Republicans, and they are an interesting sector as well. First of all, many of them did not support the president in 2016 and are continuing to oppose him on a variety of issues. They include amongst their leadership folks who are very high up in journalistic, economic, and financial fields, who have articulated a kind of message inside the Republican Party that this president does not reflect their interests and their perspectives about republicanism in America. There is a third category of Republican voters who are principally within the Orthodox Jewish world, and they are a growing and newer segment of voters who have a kind of religious values agenda, which include certainly school choice, other religious values that define their perspectives about the courts, about American culture and society, and certainly also about Israel. And that voter segment is increasingly growing within Orthodox circles, as we have seen over the past 20 years, a significant rise among Orthodox Jews in terms of their republicanism. And that has been a shift in time to that position. I would tell you that in 2016, Donald Trump's 7 of his top 17 donors were Jewish, again reminding us of the role of financial support for candidates that has been a dominant theme in American Jewish political practice in recent years. The other interesting theme from 2016 that may or may not play out in 2020 is that both sides, that is Jewish Democrats and Jewish Republicans, did not show up in the same numbers of voting that we had seen in earlier elections. We have estimated that over the last 40 years, Jews vote on average 8 out of 10 American Jews vote, even higher potentially. But those numbers fell in 2016, and we have that data from a Brandeis University study of Jewish millennials, but we also have it from a study of Jewish Republicans who also did not vote. In both cases, we saw the ideological divides of a Bernie Sanders candidacy that was therefore not acknowledged and not part of the November 2016 election cycle. And those Jewish voters simply sat out the 2016 campaign. And on the Republican side, voters either went to the Libertarian candidate in 2016 or elected as well not to vote in that election. Whether we will see some of that again in 2020 is difficult to project, but what we do believe is that in 2020, there will be a likelihood of many new voters. And here we have an interesting new reality. There will be, in the course of this election, a number of Gen Zs who will qualify for the first time to cast ballots. And while the percentage of Jewish voters amongst them may be relatively small, this is an interesting cohort of voters because they are likely to really have some influence by the fact that there are more than 4 million of them, and that by the fact that in the American voting circles, where only about 55 to 60% of eligible American voters vote at all, they will play an important role in the outcome of this election. Next slide, please. Indeed, this is an election where there are a number of states in play, and because of the uniqueness of voting by absentee ballots, as we mentioned earlier, many Jewish audiences will be for the first time experiencing some significant pressures for them to vote, and for them to vote for the candidates that are being certainly put before them by the way of publicity and influence. Traditionally, Ohio and Florida, Pennsylvania, and other states were seen as battleground states. We now believe in 2020 that that will be an extended number of states, and where Jewish populations are important, even if very small. And we would remind ourselves that American Jews account for only 1.8, maybe 2% of all of this nation's 330 million residents. But nonetheless, we do know that Jews vote in significant numbers, and therefore even in a very close election, a change in percentages of 1 to 2 to 3% can be particularly significant. And as we have noted, in states such as Georgia and also North Carolina, as well as Arizona, and states that have historically not been in play, there will be an increased amount of attention paid to those states. And in reality, there are certainly Jewish communities in each of those constituencies. Third-party candidates are always interesting, and we will have actually a Jewish candidate as a vice presidential nominee on the Green Party ticket. And we are likely to see some other interesting outcomes with third-party candidates who clearly will not have any impact in terms of the election determination, but can certainly, by the taking away of a particular percentage of voters in close races or close state elections, can bear some pressure or affect some outcomes. The question of who's voting this time around will be certainly the most important issue. because we believe that many Americans are probably not as comfortable voting electronically, meaning by absentee ballot, and therefore we will have to watch with great interest the three questions. The issue of how the election results are seen, meaning are they seen as with any degree of fraud or fraudulence? Are they seen as having been applied to the legal standards that have been established by the states? And I would remind you that states define and determine election practices. And therefore, we will watch specifically in efforts that may be designed to limit voting in certain states. And that has certainly been an issue across parts of the United States in past elections. And while it has not directly affected Jewish voters have been alarmed and concerned about the inability of other constituencies to have their votes count with the same degree of importance and accuracy. Next slide, please. Clearly, Israel, as I suggested earlier, it may not be the central target for many Jewish voters. It is always a target of interest to the media. And every media outlet is consistently asking the question of how the Jewish vote will be seen in the context of Israel. German television asked me recently the question of whether Donald Trump or Joe Biden would serve Israel and American Jewish interests to a greater or lesser degree. And I reminded them that American voters and American Jewish voters in this case are truly diffuse, meaning there is no sort of central agenda or idea that defines and directs the instituting of voting. And the important reality here is that both campaigns will play to their Jewish credentials, as has been the case of voting constituencies for a number of years. The Democratic Party this week, by the way, has released its first draft of its platform on the Middle East. And that statement has drawn some positive responses from a wide array of audiences. And it will be interesting to compare it to the 2016 platform statement because that drew some criticism and concerns, especially because of the fight around that platform position between progressives and moderates. And while this platform seems to be far less, at least at the moment, contentious, we will have to see how the progressive moderate divide inside the Democratic Party itself will play out, as party politics will be an important reality. In many ways, I'm reminded of the fact that most American Jews live within 10 states. And those states are the obvious larger constituency states of Florida and New York, California, Pennsylvania amongst them. And to realize that increasingly Jewish voters in these non-sort of core Jewish states are going to be playing a more visual and vital role as we move forward in this campaign. In many ways, the election is seen as a divide between two ideologies that seem to dominate inside the Jewish community, although these are certainly general statements about Jewish political behavior. Identity politics, where Jews vote sort of the sense of self-interest, is often pitted or defined against global Jewish voting, voters who look at the sort of universe, the larger agendas of what would make America a stronger, coherent, and vital, just society. And that may be an interesting denominator or definer of understanding Jewish political behavior. The next slide. Obviously, much of what will be happening in the political campaign will be focused around the roles played by Jewish institutions, and two in particular, although there will be others: the Republican Jewish Coalition and the Jewish Democratic Council of America, JDCA, and the RJC, really will be important voices. And certainly their activities will be situated or defined around the locales where this election will be most dominant. In the current Congress, the 116th Congress, as you see on this chart, there are a significant number of members of the Congress that are Jewish, 34 members in the House that are Democrats, 2 Republicans, and on the Senate side, you will see, I believe, 9 senators that are Jewish. So you can look at just those numbers alone to realize that there are significant numbers of Jewish candidates running at every election cycle. And this is not going to be the exception. We have candidates running, for example, in Alaska. The senatorial race in Alaska has an interesting Jewish candidate running against the incumbent. We see candidates running in throughout the South, the Northeast, and in parts of the Midwest who are Jewish. And we have seen a growing number of Jewish candidates in the South and Southwest in the last number of cycles, including this cycle as well. What we are identifying here certainly is also the increasing role of PAC money. The 2012 election cost both parties and both candidates, Mitt Romney, as you will recall, as the Republican candidate, and Barack Obama as the Democratic candidate. That was a $2.4 billion campaign. It was America's most expensive. And we expect this year to see another cycle of huge amounts of monies being extended. Part of that already has happened during the Democratic primaries, and part of it now, of course, is all being geared up by both parties and by both political establishments, in a sense, to raise additional dollars. And those are important to Jewish audiences because of the significant interest and funding streams that both Jewish PAC monies play in particular causes and interests, as well as the general giving to the two major parties and their candidates. At this point, Brian, I'm going to take a pause to allow for questions, and then we can move on to some of the other data in this study.
Absolutely. If people have questions, please post them in the box, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can.
While we are waiting on questions, I should point out that there are some important books that I would recommend to you that are certainly worth taking a look at. As you may know, Senator Ben Sasse of Nebraska has written a book called Them. It takes a look at really the sort of political divide in this country from a perspective that the senator sees and is living with. There's another book by Ezra Klein, writing also about the topic of this sort of political divide in America. And Ezra Klein, as a journalist and writer, is looking again at the sources of this. We have other writers that continue to produce volumes dealing with the really complex and divisive nature of American politics in the 21st century. David Goodhart and his writings, The Road to Somewhere, reflect yet another dimension of this. There are also 2 American Jewish political scientists who have come out with new books. And one of them is by Ohio State's Herb Weisberg, his excellent book called The Politics of American Jews. And the second by the University of Florida's Ken Wald. Kenneth Wald is writing about American Jewish liberalism. So both of those are new and give insights into Jewish political ideas from different academic perspectives.
So the first question was just a clarification on the last slide, the RJC and the JDCA, if you could repeat what those actually stand for.
Surely. The Republican Jewish Coalition, which is actually the older of the 2 bodies. has been around since 1985 and is a central sort of address for Jewish Republican thought and certainly support for Republican candidates. And on the Democratic side, the Democratic Jewish side has gone through several changes and restructuring. The current structure is the JDCA, the Jewish Democratic Council of America, and it too seeks to poll and assess and support and garner support for a voice among Jewish Democrats within the party and to certainly secure voting support for the party.
Bringing two questions together, the question was asked is how will the Black Lives Matter movement influence Jewish voters, as well as the current issues of racism play out within Jewish voters or for Jewish voters?
It's difficult because most of our data and our ability to sort of measure Jewish voting behavior was asked prior to some of the events associated with the George Floyd situation and the events that have transpired in May, June, and now July. So we don't have certainly the immediacy of the impact of what is taking place sort of as an undercurrent of the activities of Black Lives Matter. What we do have, however, is historic data that reinforces a longstanding support on the part of the Jewish community for the civil rights and equal access and equal economic opportunities for African Americans. And what we also have is a growing concern on the part of some Jewish audiences having to do with the concerns about the rise of Black anti-Semitism. Although that has been in play in and out for years, the degree to which it's drawn particular attraction in the last few months certainly has brought it forward yet again. I think there is a good deal of misrepresentation at the moment between Black Lives Matter and other groups within the Black Lives Matter coalition, including groups that have ideological positions, for example, on Israel. In and of itself, Black Lives Matter has not created a platform and is a bottom-up kind of infrastructure, very different from other groups, both inside the African American community and certainly within the Jewish community. So there are a variety of voices in the Black Lives Matter movement that both may embrace particular issues that are problematic to Jewish audiences and other components of that movement that certainly are supportive of ties both to American Jews and to Israel. So it's a much more complicated and complex set of relationships than may be seen by looking at some of the media reports.
Now here's an interesting question. It asked, how do Jews stand on character as an issue?
Well, again, when asked, we have data from both 2018 and more recent data, and we'll see that in I think in one of the slides that will come up after these questions, that point to the interesting fact that people are very concerned about character because they believe, from what we can tell from the surveys, that character in a sense defines the outcome. It shapes attitudes about how both the country is perceived, how the country perceives its leadership, and how the world understands or looks at American society and its political elites. So in referencing to questions related to character, Jewish audiences, along with many other audiences, oppose this as an important issue and concern.
A question asked, and it's asking you as an academic, it's interesting to ask, is the position of Jews in academia has become problematic. Do you see this as a continuing trend?
I think for sure, in the short term, we're going through some extraordinary difficult times. We have the, in a sense, coalescing of a series of crises. We have a racial crisis in the country. We have a pandemic. We have an economic crisis. And when those all are, in a sense, interlaced with one another, it creates both in the core body politic of a society, anger, frustration, conspiracy, and fear. For academics, it creates the notion that their sense of knowledge and authority and competence is brought into question. And it's frequently challenged in the context of some of these issues having to do with the role of the university as a free speech environment. It has to do with the role of the university in also the institutions established by those particular universities, which have ties, historic ties to American leaders of the 19th century who were either anti-Semitic or who may have been pro-slavery or who carried other agendas that in today's marketplace are seen as problematic. So often, because Jews are seen as important decision makers at American universities and colleges, in many cases because of their seniority on faculty and their increasing role in administration. Some of this is clearly directed and targeted to them and in their roles, and part of it is directed in the more generic way because of the frustrations and anxieties existing throughout the society.
Do you want to take a few more questions, or?
I think we can go on, and maybe some of the issues that are being posed will be dealt with in the context of the material we're about to look at. Can we go? Yes. So in this particular slide, this is a study from September of 2019 by California State University Pat Brown Institute. And the study is designed to really tell us a good deal about Jewish political behavior in Los Angeles County. But the county is significant in that it is a complex society of many different Jewish groupings. And so what we are seeing here is clearly a sampling of something almost of a year ago of how American Jewish audiences understood the political environment. What is particularly interesting about this slide is the high concern for anti-Semitism. The second important factor is the huge amount of political engagement by Los Angeles County voters, meaning that they attended rallies, that they signed petitions, that they discussed regularly political events at home and in other circles, that they were engaged as voters, and that they gave money to political causes. The volume, that is the extensive volume when compared to any other white audiences or groupings, is profoundly significant by these huge and very important numbers. The higher educational levels of American Jews, as also found within this study, simply is confirming again that Jewish voters come to their politics from a variety of different streams of information, of learning, and of culture, and that the tendency to believe that there's a kind of lockstep Jewish vote is disproved, and certainly one can confirm the presence of so many factors that influence how voters, especially that we are fourth and fifth generation American today, in understanding that the old notions that Jews Jews lived like Episcopalians and voted like Puerto Ricans, which was the viewpoint of an American Jewish Committee sociologist, Milton Himmelfarb, of some 50 years ago, is a bit too simplistic. That the Jewish vote is clearly a much more complex composition of forces. The next slide, please. I think that this election is very much a challenge to the Jewish community, both from the left and the right, as I've said at the outset of our conversation this evening, because I believe that we are seeing pressures on Jewish voters to deal with their concerns, their anxieties, as reflected both in the last slide, but also as reflected in every study we now have about American Jews concerning the BDS movement, anti-Semitism, fear and feelings of concern because of the high profile nature and character of Jews in American society, that this election, in a sense, is targeted by the fact that both the right and the left, in some measure, are seeking to push against Jewish whiteness. Jews are perceived by the right as sort of pretenders, replacing the white establishment, and by the left as losing their credentials as a minority because they have become, quote, too white and have taken on the attributes of an established kind of culture and community. The next slide, please. I think in many ways, the 2020 election for American Jews is about a whole array of considerations, and many voters will tell you that they're going to vote on November 3rd for any number of priorities and causes, whether it is judgeships and the whole question of how America and its court systems view the long-term cultural and social fabric of this society, maybe one of those core ingredients. But other factors certainly are prominent as well, and we understand those to be from a wide array of interests that Jewish audiences have, from immigration to education, to questions of economic justice, to concerns about the economy in its more general terms, and certainly about the challenges of governance. How are we managing, and can we do better? And that is certainly being weighed more recently by most of the studies that garner minority voting to be concerned about the general health and character of the society at a time when it is clearly divided and deeply in crisis. Next slide. I mean, I think that the longer term questions are the major issues for us. I think that American Jews and Americans in general are really seeking some kind of bipartisanship and civility in the society, and seeking to return to a kind of a barometer of truth where the behaviors and the operations of our institutions reflect this capacity to disagree, but to disagree comfortably and without division and anger. There is also a major concern on the part of many that unless we return to a higher level of trust in institutions, that this is the death knell of American democracy. And as we have seen elsewhere in the world, democracies are in trouble. And the concerns in this society ought to emphasize the importance that when people lose confidence in their leadership and institutions of government, they then ultimately lose belief in the system itself. And that serves no better interests than those people both inside this nation and outside who seek to sort of tear down this sort of demonstration of democracy that we have tried to create over these 240 years. The other reality in this election is that the United States in the world needs to reassert its role. And that role has to be debated. It is not merely a Republican role or a Democratic role. It needs to have the voice of a bipartisan consensus on political priorities that we share globally. And for minority communities in particular, security, liberty are very powerful themes. Religious liberty, meaning the preservation and protection of rights and opportunities to be a part of a society in which religion has a role to play and religious thought is seen as an important voice both politically, but morally and socially. And that security, the individual sense that he or she is secure. And that is an interesting issue for American Jews, because the whole notion of feeling the sense of pressure about what role government plays, both in dealing with the pandemic, but also in dealing with the larger role of being citizens. And what is the balance between the rights of the individual and the role of the government? And privacy issues, personal rights issues are now resurfacing as major challenges. We see it in the States, we see it often in demonstrations, and we need to understand it as something that certainly is in conversation in Jewish audiences as well. So these then are the longer term questions that I think as American societies we need to deal with: trust, foreign affairs, civility and bipartisanship, religious liberty, and individual security. I think there may be this additional slide here. I want to remind you that 40% of Americans do not vote. And the last election where we had over 60% of eligible voters participating was the Nixon-Kennedy election of 1960. And since then, we've seen a curve that has suggested that clearly under 60% of eligible voters have been voting. And those numbers have dropped to 50, 52, 55%. We need to do better. And that is an important issue, again, because it demonstrates the loss of confidence and belief that my vote counts. And while Jews hold very strong beliefs about democracy and the American system, we need to share that belief and convey it to other audiences. And civic responsibility of community service and civic education is a second principle that I think as American Jews, we all find as essential and important. And as I've said in the earlier slide about bipartisanship, as an important feature, especially in areas related to foreign affairs and understanding some consensus around core values of the American story. I believe that pretty well concludes the formal presentations. I'm happy to take additional questions and clarify materials we've presented.
I think we have time for just a couple more. One question was asked, do you not feel that the predominant reason that many Jewish Americans did vote for Trump was identity politics, clearly just because they were better for Israel?
24% of American Jews voted for Donald Trump in 2016. That is based actually on both CNN and New York Times exit polling. What we garnered from both that vote and also from interviews with Republican Jewish voters and other studies thereafter is that Donald Trump was seen as particularly a friend of Israel and had in his both political campaign, as brief as it had been, as well as in his earlier life experiences in working with Jews, been a strong supporter and friend of the state of Israel. I have a feeling that part of that vote was generated as much by the unhappiness of some Republicans with the Democratic nominee, and therefore contributed to the president's particular standing in 2016. I am of the mind that the president will, as he is likely at the moment at least, based on all of the data that we have, is likely to lose some ground from where he was in 2016, that we will see some decline in Jewish support for this president in November. We saw some of that play out actually in November of 2018. Well, while the president was not on the ballot, he was certainly identified with key races in various parts of the country. And voters were given the opportunity in exit polling to indicate how much Donald Trump played a role in their thinking and in their support. And that diminished even in the 2-year period we saw from 2016. And so at the moment, looking at what we know at this point, we're likely to see a smaller percentage of Jewish support for the president at this particular time.
I think we'll take this as the last question, because I know we could go on for quite a while longer, but want to respect everybody's time. The question reads, it feels like in some ways this election is a referendum on decency and tolerance. How will the results impact future elections and future candidates? And can America at some point resolve any of the conflicts that seem to be tearing us apart?
It's a great observation and a critical question. We can only hope that we will be able to resolve some of the tensions over time. I will tell you rather candidly, this will be a very ugly election. We expect between now and November some particularly nasty infighting by both sides. And I don't believe that the election itself will be doing much for healing the nation, and contributing to that sort of a tenuous situation is certainly the pandemic that we are living with and having to manage. So it is hopeful that over the course of time beyond the election, that we will see some movement on the part of both political establishments to reassert a kind of level of decency and an agenda of commonality, if you wish, for trying to move us as a country forward. The failure to do so will be for historians the mark that the country at one of its deepest and darkest moments may have failed its citizens and in turn failed humanity.
Good question for us to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Windmueller. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Rabbi Harry Rosenfeld. Sorry, Harry, all of a sudden the bug flew by. And to finish up for our evening.
Stephen, thank you so much. I really appreciate your insights. There were a lot more questions, and which really tells me that people were totally engaged and were really following what you said. And thank you so much for being with us, and thank you to everybody who's here tonight with us, both live on Zoom and also watching on Facebook Live. I want to remind everybody also that our next program will be in a couple of weeks on August 2nd. This says 6 p.m. Mountain Time, but they'll be the same time as it was this week in whatever time zone you happen to be in. The link to sign on is absolutely the same. So please join us in a couple of weeks for Rabbi Jeff Salkin. And I love the title, There's a Crack in Everything, The Enduring Relevance of Leonard Cohen. And so personally being a Leonard Cohen fan, I'm looking forward to that. Stephen, really thank you. Thank you to all my colleagues who are helping with this, and thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful evening.